There are two teams out there. One is playing cricket, the other is making no attempt to do so.
This normally gentle crowd at Adelaide seemed to be on the verge of revolt.
Some of the England players later said that they were sort of working out ways of grabbing a stump to defend themselves when the crowd came swarming over the pickets.
The whole matter of Bodyline was whether the imperial masters were cheats or not. That Australians at that time always expected Englishmen to behave like gentlemen, and it suddenly turned out that Englishmen did not behave like gentlemen.
Larwood is faster today than ever, and this slow-motion study reveals his action very clearly and bowls to a leg trap to which Bradman falls a victim when he has only scored 8.
Bradman knew very well that everything that was being organised by MCC, by Jardine and the Pace battery was aimed at him.
It was indeed an assault on our Don Bradman, who was the most cherished object in the whole of Australia, and that just heightened the shock factor. I think bodyline is the most emotive word in the whole world of cricket, which is saying something. It's so long ago, but it was so devastating to Anglo-Australian relations.
Rockley Wilson did make this famous remark when he heard that Jardine had been appointed captain. He said, well, we may win the Ashes, but we may well lose the Dominion.
The year is 1930. The world teeters on the verge of a great economic depression, triggered by the Wall Street stock market crash in October 1929. It was in this time of fear and great uncertainty that two of Australia's greatest sporting icons would make their indelible mark on the national psyche. In the 1930 Melbourne Cup, a horse by the name of Farlap would win the race that stopped the nation, carrying 62.5 kilograms, over 4 kilograms more than any other 4-year-old horse had ever carried in the Cup. At 11 to 8 on, Farlap was the shortest price favourite to win the Melbourne Cup. That very same year, on the cricket fields of England, a diminutive 21-year-old country boy from the New South Wales town of Bowral was hitting his way into the record books. During the 1930 tour of England, young Don Bradman scored 2,960 runs at an average of 98.67. In the Test matches, he scored 974 runs at a phenomenal average of 139.14. At the spiritual home of cricket, Lords, Bradman scored a chanceless 254. At Leeds, he scored 309 in a single day's play on his way to a then record 334. In the final test at the Oval, Bradman scored 232.
The greatest challenge in cricket history since W.G. Grace was D.G. Bradman. And it was a problem that worried a lot of English cricket people, because it really did seem that Bradman was perhaps one day going to make 500 in a test match. Would England ever win again?
Cricket was the game England invented, that England had always considered itself to be the master at, and then suddenly, here out of some strange back blocks place named Bowral, and there should be a man who was threatening to overthrow the whole culture of English cricket.
The English upper class was offended by this pipsqueak from New South Wales coming and knocking them all around the ground. That was where the problem was.
People who ruled at Lords were all very eminent men. They were lawyers, politicians, lords. They represented the cream of English society, and I suppose they cared about England's image.
We have to bring down this man Bradman to basic size. If we don't, the Ashes are gone for 10 or 15 years. So how do we do it? What chinks are there in his armour?
Bradman's batting to Larwood. That gives him his century.
The man that the MCC charged with the responsibility of taming the Bradman Colossus and restoring the prestige of English cricket was Douglas Robert Jardine.
A definition of cricket which has always struck me as being the only worthy definition of cricket. It was described as this by a New Zealander when he said it was their beautiful, beautiful game that is battle and service and sport and art.
My father was born in India, where his father was a judge in Bombay, and from a small boy he was sent across to the UK for his education, first at Horace Hill Prep School and then at Winchester and then on to Oxford. And in all that time, he only would get back to India to his parents once a year in the long summer holidays.
Winchester College was founded in 1382 by the then Bishop of Winchester, who came from a town, a village nearby called Wickham, and was known as William of Wickham. They decided at some stage, when old boys of schools were accorded names, that Wickhamist was what a boy from Winchester College should be called. He was, of course, here when the school was racked with the First World War, and daily, weekly, the death toll of recent Wickhamists was unfolded. It must have been a terrible time.
Some of the accounts of the conditions there, I mean, they just beggar belief. They were expected to run naked in all weathers out to the bathhouse, you know, when it was snowing, and there seemed to be quite a lot of time set aside during the day for corporal punishment. During the First World War, there were some very serious food shortages, in addition to which there was a certain amount of enforced labour on local farms as part of the war effort. So that was his childhood.
The Spartan upbringing in the austere surroundings of Winchester College, one of Britain's oldest public schools, would shape the young Douglas Jardine's philosophy towards life and cricket.
I think he was marked by his education at Winchester and the feeling of being of service that's instilled into students there. And he was perhaps rather establishment, I think you would say, in outlook.
These public schools were set up to educate young men to go out and run the empire. And he was very much a product of that system.
Seems to be
the Bodyline story is said to have had its genesis during the 5th Test at the Oval in 1930. Bradman was batting in a very important partnership with 20-year-old Archie Jackson. After a lengthy delay because of rain, the players returned to the field of play. England fast bowler Harold Larwood began to make the ball fly on the moist pitch.
Archie Jackson did get hit black and blue. He made a very valiant 73. Bradman creamed on to 232. And George Duckworth, the England wicketkeeper, noted that Bradman seemed to be flinching, and this was so untypical. He put his feet normally where he wanted them to. Now he was putting them where the bowler wanted them to be, and they weren't always in line. He didn't get hit. Archie Jackson did.
My father told me that they had watched films of Bradman batting to try and discover any small weakness that he might have, because nobody seemed able to stop him from making runs.
He was thought to have flinched when facing Harold Larwood. Well, he went on to score 230 odd, so he obviously wasn't struggling too much. But Jardine got a film of this innings, and at the moment when Bradman flinched, Jardine is supposed to have said, "That's it, he's yellow."
Jardine would base his plan of attack on a form of bowling known as leg theory, a purely defensive tactic that proved successful in curbing the batting of the immortal Victor Trumper some 20 years earlier.
Frank Foster had bowled so well for England in Australia back in 1911-12 with S.F. Barnes. Now, Foster was not attempting to intimidate. To Victor Trumper, he was pitching the ball outside the off and rapping him on the thigh because the ball was moving so sharply. And he had a leg side field, and these were the things that Jardine studied.
There's a world of difference between leg theory and bodyline. Leg theory is something just to keep you, to shut you up, bowling down the leg side to a leg side field.
Jardine called his plan fast leg theory, but the cricket world would later come to know it as bodyline. It involved a fast bowler bowling short rising deliveries at the batsman. pitching the ball on the line of the leg stump. 6 fieldsmen would be placed in a leg trap, waiting to take a catch from an unsuccessful defensive stroke or a mistimed hook shot. Should the batsman be successful in hooking the rising delivery over the waiting leg trap, 2 fieldsmen were placed in the outfield on the boundary to accept a catch.
There was certainly nothing to stop a captain putting 11 men on the leg side, if that was what he thought was appropriate. Indeed, some of the leg theory, the Foster leg theory stuff, an awful lot of people turned up on the leg side, and that was not against the law. It was only later on, after the changes as a result of the Bodyline, that the law started governing the number of people who could be on, number of fielders on the leg side.
The 2 men chosen to spearhead Jardine's plan would be the opening pair from Nottingham, Harold Larwood and Bill Vose.
He was born in Nunca Gate, which is a little village in Nottinghamshire. It's about 12 miles from Nottingham, and it was a coal mining area, and so his father and his grandfather before him worked down the mines.
At that time, all the mine owners were very, very keen on cricket, so they really encouraged their young miners to play cricket, and anyone who did play cricket usually got a fairly cushy job in the mine.
The mines was a very hard, arduous life, which would deflate even the strongest of men. And, oh yes, I would imagine he'd be thrilled to get out of that environment, yes.
Well, it was in the summer of 1932 when the tour was imminent, and Jardine felt it was time to sit down with Arthur Carr, who's a key figure here. He was a Nottinghamshire captain who'd already employed Larwood and Vose in using bodyline tactics in county cricket. Not at all popular either, but they caused quite a bit of damage in the county championship ranks. So they sat down at the grill room of the Piccadilly Hotel in Piccadilly in the West End of London. Carr, Larwood and Vose and Jardine, and talked it all over.
But he would stop at nothing to win, and he was so determined. He'd seen how England had suffered under the Don in England in 1930, and he wasn't going to have it.
The degree to which he had the blessing and support of MCC is an area where we can only speculate. You would suppose, yes, that they selected this man back in 1931 as the leader for the next Ashes encounter. He had all the qualities they were seeking, and they felt probably they had the ammunition too in the form of these 2 fast bowlers and quite a good batting lineup as well. So I think the nabobs at Lord's had started thinking about this well before the tour actually got underway.
It was quite clear. He told us it had all been agreed, worked out and agreed with the MCC, that was the way the game was going to be played, and it was the only way to stop Bradman from getting runs, or might be the only way that they would stop him from getting runs. So I think he kept to what had been agreed and got all the blame, probably, for it.
First whistle has just gone. We've had a wonderful send-off at St Pancras and all the way down the line. And when we get to Australia, we shan't forget the good wishes of those who've been kind enough to come and see us off. And we hope that he will do as they hope we will do and return with the Ashes.
Rockley Wilson, a much loved and respected Don, as we call them here, for many years, who played cricket for England, was the master in charge of cricket in Jardine's time. He was asked by someone of his view on Jardine's appointment as captain of England, to which he replied, "We may win the Ashes, but we might lose a Dominion."
Gubby Allen said that Jardine would say, "We have to hate them. That's the only way we're going to beat them." And Gubby Allen thought, well, that's, do we really need to, I mean, we want to win, sure, but... And there was this kind of intensity.
On the way out, on the Orontes, he summoned his team, and he announced that Don Bradman, from here on in, will not be called Don Bradman, or Don, or Bradman. He'll be called the Little Bastard.
The arrival of the 1932-33 MCC team was greeted with excitement and eager anticipation. These were the days when Australia was still a dominion of the British Empire, an Ashes tour was seen as an ideal way to further strengthen and enhance the bonds of empire. These sentiments were reflected in the words of Australia's captain, Bill Woodfull.
You have sent us a great side, but after all, that's just what we Australians expect of the home country. Win or lose, the motherland has always put up a strenuous fight.
As a father and as a school teacher and a headmaster principal, there was that strict disciplinary streak, and his word was just, there was no other alternative. You just had to obey.
He was a man of absolute stern principle, gentle nature, quality in so many ways, quiet, thoughtful, serene, and you could only feel that Australian cricket had been in safe hands when Woodfull had been the Australian captain in 32-33.
Douglas Jardine had previously toured Australia in 1928-29 as a member of Percy Chapman's very successful team, one that has been rated by many as possibly the strongest MCC side to visit Australia in the 20th century. Jardine soon found himself the target of incessant barracking from the vocal Australian crowds. His habit of batting in a harlequin cap raised the ire of many of the working-class spectators.
A harlequin is something, it's an Oxford University club, and all blues and those who are near to the Oxford side are made harlequins. And it's a famous club, goes back many years. And of course it's a colourful and beautiful cap.
I'm sure my father did irritate them, and he irritated them in other ways by wearing his harlequin cap and that sort of thing. And I think that he did that as much to make himself believe that he was going to succeed. I think it was to steel himself to cope.
The harlequin cap, of course, was a lovely reminder of the elitist status of those who'd come from the right university. And again, it may have been a little bit this business of just reminding the natives that one had come from a certain status, one was of officer caste, and one was not going to be torn down by the crude and uncouth barracking of these people who insisted on shouting rude things at one.
The barracking got more and more personal as the tour progressed, and it really did get to him. At Sydney, he played an innings which Bradman described, no less, as one of the best displays of stroke play that he'd ever seen. Jardine scored about 140, a big 100, and he was barracked a lot. And as he came into the dressing room, I was told this by someone who was in the dressing room, and Patsy Hendren was going out to bat, and Hendren said to Jardine, they don't seem to like you over here, Mr. Jardine. And Jardine said, it is fucking mutual.
The MCC's bowling tactics were revealed for the first time during one of the early matches against an Australian 11 in Melbourne. Bradman played in this match and was quick to reveal his concerns to his New South Wales teammates when he returned to Sydney.
I can particularly remember Don Bradman coming in. We were playing Victoria, and Don wasn't playing. At that stage, we hadn't seen the English team play. And he said, I want to tell you fellows, he said, you have no idea what this summer's going to be like. He said, you just can't visualise it.
When the MCC played New South Wales, many of the batsmen took a pounding and the writing was on the wall. However, there was nothing in the laws of cricket as they stood at the time to prevent the use of such intimidatory tactics.
We just saw what we saw, that it was a leg side field and the bowlers were bowling bumpers, and we could visualise the fact, I didn't play in any of the tests in that series, we could visualise the fact that it'd be a pretty tough way to score runs.
However, the prime focus of the MCC's tactics, Don Bradman, was not certain to play in the test matches because of a contractual dispute with the Board of Control.
Don Bradman had a contract with 2UE and F.J. Palmer's, and also with the Sydney Sun newspaper. And the board said, you can't write for them, and he said, well, I'll not play cricket then. and he was allowed to... his employers at the Sun said, well, you don't have to write for us. They exonerated him. You play cricket. We'd rather you're out there.
And Ashes series at the time in Australia, without Don Bradman playing for Australia, was something that was almost unthinkable after what had happened in 1930, after the way he'd been received back in Australia after the 1930 tour.
Just think what might have happened if Bradman hadn't played at all in 1932-33. Would we even have seen Bodyline? Would we be talking about it now? It's a nice thought.
More shocks were to follow. On the eve of the first Test match, Bradman was ruled unfit to play because of a throat infection and a dose of the flu. Interest in the Test series was unprecedented. A huge crowd packed into the Sydney Cricket Ground to witness firsthand the fury of the Bodyline assault.
There was certainly a sense of anticipation. The air was sort of electric. It was the greatest crowds I think the game's ever seen. They just flocked to see it, and there was an element of sort of danger in the play in those days, which I had never seen before or since.
They didn't know what to call this form of attack. Bouncers bowled at a batsman with all those fielders waiting for a parry, a catch. It was called direct attack, it was called shock attack. The Australian cricketers called it sconers. But a journalist who was an ex-Test cricketer from 1899 called Jack Worrell was writing in the Australasian, which was a weekly, and he talked about the bowling being on the line of the body. This had other people thinking. Hugh Buggy in the Melbourne Herald then said on the body line. And then Ray Robinson, who was a young sub-editor in the Herald offices, joined the words together. And although it didn't appear in the headline on that first historic afternoon, in that edition, somewhere in the story was body-line, and a word was born that is with us still.
They were all timeless tests, so you could not play for a draw. There had to be a result. So there's no point in ducking and weaving and letting the ball go past. You had to try and score runs, because the only way to win a game is by scoring more runs than your opponents. So that was quite an important factor in making sure that people actually had to play the ball rather than duck.
Enter 22-year-old Stan McCabe, who would play the innings of his life.
All the family had come up from Grenfell, Mum and Dad and the three brothers, and he sat with them while the openers did their best. And when it was time to pad up, he said to his dad, if I get hit out there, Dad, make sure Mum doesn't jump the fence.
McCabe hooked Larwood and Vose ferociously, launching a courageous assault on the bodyline bowling, delighting the huge crowd.
Stan was utterly fearless. The shorter they bowled at him, the harder he hooked them. And I'll never forget the moment when he just played one or two lovely hooks, and there were fieldsmen sort of ducking everywhere. And Larwood came up and bowled, and Stan sort of let the ball go, and just as it was flashing by, he just caressed it through the slips to the fence. Well, I've never heard such a roar go up, you know. It was one of the finest and the most dramatic innings that I've ever seen.
McCabe went on to score 187 not out in Australia's total of just 360. This heroic innings is regarded as one of the finest in the history of Test cricket.
And had not Stan McCabe made that astonishing 187 not out, where you had luck, he admitted that, you needed luck. It could be that the two would have ground to a halt somehow. But what Stan unfortunately proved was that with a bit of luck you could make runs against it. And if only Bradman had played in that test and had made runs too, perhaps Jardine would have rethought.
Despite McCabe's remarkable defiance, England went on to win the first test comfortably by 10 wickets. Much discussion now centred on whether Australia would retaliate and give the MCC batsmen a barrage of bouncers with a leg side field in place.
I can't see Bill Woodfull ever, as he would have considered it, I'm sure, stooping to using retaliatory tactics by trying the lesser Australian bowlers as an Australian version of bodyline bowlers. He was just not the man to do it. I feel he felt too strongly against it, and while a Vic Richardson almost certainly would have done it if he'd been captain and one or two others may well have done.
But here was Victor Richardson wanting retaliation, and one of the few things that he said to me about Bodyline and about cricket was, don't believe that rubbish that they say that Australia didn't have the fast bowlers to hand it back. He said, we had the fast bowlers to give them back Bodyline. And he said, I know that they didn't want to face Bodyline. He said, because I overheard a couple of the English batsmen talking, and they said, if Australia bowl this shit at us, we're going to tell the captain to stop it because we can't afford to get hit in the head because we're professional cricketers. We can't afford to be out of the game for 6 months because it's our living down the drain. And Vic said, I was saying to Woodfull, we've got to give it back to them and that'll stop it. That'll bring it to an end really quickly. But he said Woodfull was too much of a gentleman and he believed that it wasn't the right thing. And so it didn't happen.
Had Vic Richardson been in charge, I think that Australia would have retaliated. And it may have stopped it, and it may also have made it an even uglier series if that were possible, and it could have rent Australia and England apart for who knows how many years.
That was probably Dad's greatest contribution to the game of cricket. One would wonder, really, just where Test cricket would have finished if there'd been retaliation by the Australians.
Bradman returned for the second Test in Melbourne. A then record crowd of 64,000 packed into the MCG to welcome back their prodigal son. He was cheered all the way to the wicket.
A sports star like Bradman in the time of depression was the man who was going to lead us into a promised land of, if not prosperity, at least success over England. So you can imagine that enormous cauldron of the MCG, which is still the most thrilling centrepiece for sporting drama, how that must have been set for battle on that day.
So he took strike, and Bill Bowes, the big bespectacled Yorkshireman, is at the end of his not unduly long run, and he wanted to bowl, but the cheering went on and on. So to pass the time, Bill Bowes just moved a fielder around on the square leg fence. Don Bradman noticed this and probably felt, well, there's bound to be a bouncer.
Australia's saviour, Bradman, was out. First ball for a duck.
You could have heard a pin drop. The only noise, apparently, was Jardine out at mid-on, hopping around like a wild man. He lost his dignity just for those few seconds, and I suppose he thought, well, what more could a man wish? After all that planning, we've got him, first ball.
It was a different story in the second innings. This time, Bradman pulled the first ball he received, ironically again from Bill Bowes, for 4 runs. The crowd let out a deafening roar. The battle was underway. Bradman attacked the bowling at every opportunity. Every run was cheered. His much-anticipated century was greeted with volcanic applause. When Australia's last man, Bert Ironmonger, was run out, Bradman remained 103 not out. Australia went on to win the second Test by 111 runs. Australia's national hero had tamed the bogey of Bodyline, or so many thought. The series was now level at 1-1. Don Bradman privately lobbied members of the Australian Board of Control to make an official protest against the MCC's Bodyline tactics. His request was ignored.
Presumably that second innings in Melbourne did make people feel all's well, the Don is in his heaven and we're okay. The man has shown us that Bodyline can be played. He's got a century. Surely the English will give up the tactics because it's not doing them any good, and we'll get back to a normal sort of test series. And the expectation must have been enormous that things were going to settle down, but Australia were going to win.
Controversy over Bodyline bowling would erupt during the third Test match in Adelaide. What would become the most infamous of all Test matches got underway, rather ominously, on Friday the 13th, in front of a huge crowd for a working day of 39,300. That number would swell to a record of 50,962 on the Saturday.
Adelaide, as is well known, is the most genteel of Australian cricket grounds. It's the most scenic. The people, I think, are least likely to barrack raucously all day long. You associate Adelaide with peace and tranquility and gentle, pleasant cricket. And that's why what happened there in January 1933 was all the more shocking.
Woodville prefers to stand his ground and duck under the flying ball, which, by the way, is travelling at 90 miles an hour.
Mother always said to me that she was very, very concerned for Dad's well-being, always happy to see him home in one piece, because there was no protective clothing.
Larwood, bowling with a new ball to a conventional offside field, struck Australian captain Bill Woodfull a very painful blow over the heart.
Now, he was no actor. He stumbled from the wicket, and it was a long time before he felt able to resume his innings. He was really hurt. He was white-faced.
After Woodfull had been hit on over the heart, then Jardine first of all turned round to Larwood and said very loudly, "Well bowled, Harold," which, with Don Bradman standing next door to him, i.e., you're going to get it next.
That was the end of the over, and after the subsequent over, Larwood resumed, and very theatrically, Jardine switched the fielders over to the Bodyline field setting. And that could have been the blackest moment of the whole series, because Australia saw that as kicking a man when he was down.
This must have convinced Woodfull personally, the team generally, and the crowd that Jardine's ruthlessness went right beyond any sort of sporting approach to the game, and must have done an enormous amount to inflame Adelaide feeling in that peaceful city.
This qualifies the whole Bodyline thing. The idea was that Larwood would bowl with an orthodox offside field when he's with a new ball, and that they'd only change round to a leg trap with the old ball. That was what made Adelaide so terribly important, that Jardine switched to a leg trap even when there was shine still on the ball.
The huge Saturday crowd voiced its disapproval, continually booing and hooting Harold Larwood as he ran into bowl. Bradman was dismissed for only 8, caught in the leg trap off Larwood. Woodfull soon followed, out for 22. The manager of the MCC team, Sir Pelham Plum Warner, visited Bill Woodfull in the Australian dressing room.
Plum Warner and his assistant, Dick Palleray, decided to make a courtesy visit to the Australian dressing room to sympathise with those two injuries with Bill Woodfull, who had either just come out of the shower or was still on the masseur's table being treated with this huge bruise over his heart. And Plum Warner offered his sympathy and was astonished and shocked when Bill Woodfull just gave vent to his emotions.
And Dad said, "I don't wish to discuss it." Why was the question. And then came Dad's well-known quote, "There are 2 teams out there. One is playing cricket, the other is making no attempt to do so." And then he added, "The game is too good to be spoilt, and it's time that some people got out of it. Good afternoon. In other words, you're dismissed." There's no doubt that Dad felt just exactly what he said.
Woodfull was hard hit by the approach of the England team. He genuinely felt it to be unethical. To tell an England team that they are not playing cricket in the 1930s was a pretty deep and damaging comment, but it was a pointer to Woodfull's high principles himself and how deeply he was hurt.
More sensations were to follow when Bill Woodfull's dressing room comments were leaked to the press. For the first time, the general public were made aware, in no uncertain terms, that Australia's captain, Bill Woodfull, strongly disapproved of Bodyline.
It would have been better probably if it hadn't been broadcast around the world. And Dad was very, very upset that it was leaked out from the dressing room. But once it was out, there was nothing that could be done.
Now, the Australian team, bar those 2 out in the middle, who I think were Ponsford and Richardson, some of them from the balcony watching the game could just about hear what was going on. So you could say that who leaked it to the press? It could have been any one of them.
Jack Fingleton, who was a professional journalist, was a member of the Australian team, and there were hints that he was the man who was involved, and of course he denied it strongly. But there is much feeling that it was leaked to Claude Corbett of the Sydney Sun, and it so happened that Donald Bradman was a columnist for the same group. Many people have put 2 and 2 together of those 2 points and made 4.
Fingleton accused Bradman. Bradman implied that it had to be Jack Fingleton, and it was a very unfortunate business in that 2 estimable men didn't speak for years.
Jack Fingleton's book, The Cricket Crisis, is well worth a good read for any that could get their hands on it. That goes into it pretty thoroughly.
The story is told me by Claude Corbett, then writing for The Sun, and a colleague of mine was this. I got a ring on the phone that night at our hotel. It was from Don Bradman, who told me he wanted to tell me something. Don was also working in a third sense for The Sun, being associated with a broadcasting firm and a sports store. We arranged a rendezvous on North Terrace, and while we sat in his car, he told me all about the Warner Woodfull incident. It was too hot a story to run on my own, and I gave it to all the press.
I was bequeathed a document by Gilbert Mant, who was the last surviving reporter on the Bodyline series. He wrote for Reuters. The document that he left me was an article he wrote shortly before he died, and he said that I was not to divulge the contents until after he and Sir Donald Bradman had passed on. Gilbert Mant died in 1997 in his 90s, and this is the document that he left me. It's a long article on the Adelaide dressing room leak, but it concludes, for some reason the story continued to intrigue me, and in 1996 I delved further into it. I telephoned Claude Corbett's son, Mac Corbett, a former Sun Herald journalist in Sydney. He told me that Claude had never mentioned the dressing room incident to his family. But I was in for a shock. When I questioned his sister, Helen Carney, she told me that after Claude's death, her mother confided in her that Claude had told her that Bradman had been the culprit, confirming the secret of the after-dark meeting as alleged by Fingleton in 1978. Now, where does that leave us? I believe implicitly in Bradman's denial and have no reason to doubt Mrs. Carney's story. Claude Corbett was a down-to-earth, hard-drinking, convivial character, fond of a practical joke. Perhaps he'd perpetrated a gigantic leg pull on Fingleton, but it was scarcely conceivable that he'd do the same thing to his wife. So we're left wondering, and I think the whole 11 Australian, well, excepting Woodfull, the 10 players are under suspicion. But the thing is, whoever put this story to the press is really a hero, because at long last, Australia knew that Bill Woodfull resented what was happening. He was angry about it, and that gave every Australian in the land carte blanche now to stand up and say, this is wrong. And we all, including Bill Woodfull, think so. And something's got to be done about it.
Bodyline became an international incident when Australian wicketkeeper Bert Oldfield had his skull fractured after being struck in the head while attempting to hook a short ball from Harold Larwood. Larwood was bowling to a conventional field at the time, but as Australian captain Bill Woodfull strode onto the ground to assist the injured Oldfield from the field, the anger of the large crowd was reaching boiling point.
This normally gentle crowd at Adelaide seemed to be on the verge of revolt, and the authorities were very worried, and there were either 200 or 400 mounted troopers at the back of the pavilion, ready to, some said they were armed.
I think they were very afraid then that the crowd might come over. And Gubby told me once that Jardine had, as it were, issued battle orders, and he'd said to Gubby, he said, if it does happen, he said, you take one stump, and he said, you'll, insofar as you can, defend Bill, and he said, I'll take the other, and he said, I'll go off with Harold.
Adelaide authorities were rightly very, very worried indeed. The combination of poverty, unemployment, and this imperialist, ungentlemanly English swine coming and knocking our heads off, the combination was lethal.
The Australian Board of Control hurriedly composed and dispatched a cable of protest to the MCC at Lords.
Bodyline bowling assumes such proportions as to menace best interests of game, making protection of body by batsmen the main consideration. causing intensely bitter feelings between players as well as injury. In our opinion, it is unsportsmanlike. Unless stopped at once, likely to upset the friendly relations existing between Australia and England.
I think my father was appalled to have been called unsportsmanlike. From his point of view, he was carrying out instructions that had been agreed with the MCC before they had set out on the tour.
To accuse an English gentleman, an MCC committee man, a man wearing the bacon and eggs tie of being unsporting, or any team under his name. And don't forget, in those days, of course, the touring team was MCC. It was sent out by the Marylebone Cricket Club.
Then to say that they considered the behaviour was unsportsmanlike, to say that to Lord Lewisham, Viscount Hailsham, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Mayor of London and others, this had to be scraped off the wall. And so no wonder these people thought, these colonials can't call us unsportsmanlike.
The MCC cabled their response.
We at the Marylebone Cricket Club deplore your cable. We deprecate your opinion that there has been unsportsmanlike play. We have the fullest confidence in captain, team and managers, and are convinced that they would do nothing to infringe either the laws of cricket or the spirit of the game. We have no evidence that our confidence is misplaced. We hope the situation is not now as serious as your cable appears to indicate. But if it is such as to jeopardise the good relations between England and Australian cricketers, and you consider it desirable to cancel remainder of programme, we would consent, but with great reluctance.
If you really want, I mean, with great regret, we'll cancel the rest of the tour, knowing full well that the Australian Board of Control couldn't possibly cancel the rest of the tour because they needed the money.
Englishmen far away in the comfort of their lounge rooms and in their committee rooms, they had no idea what was going on. It's not like today where we're seeing full-colour, live, slow-motion coverage of games thousands of miles away. They had to rely on letters and cables, and they knew that Lar would bowl bouncers and he bowled fast. Were the Australians squealing? Couldn't they take it?
He was only 5'7.5", and most people think that to be a fast bowler you have to be tall and strong. There is one story where a little boy and his father came along to meet Dad, and the little boy looked up and stopped at the 5'7.5" and said, "Geez, Dad, he doesn't look like a killer."
He was perceived as the closest thing to a mass murderer. He was after Don, he was after the rest of them. Now this had been... It had been magnified to an extent that was truly frightening, and the most frightening thing of all was the lack of comprehension because of the tyranny of distance.
The English gentleman had suddenly turned into a non-English non-gentleman and almost a cheat. And that, for the imperial masters, from the Australian point of view, was intolerable.
The spirit of cricket had been breached, this hallowed game. This game that Victorian England had given to the world, it stood for all that was great and good. It was being besmirched by the very people who had given the game to the world, and this was beyond the comprehension of a lot of Australians to start with. And then anger built up. And that phrase, "it isn't cricket," I'm sure it was current then, and it's been current since.
The level at which the diplomacy was carried through, the way something happening on a cricket field has rocketed into the innermost councils of Britain and Australia, was astonishing. You had Joe Lyons, the Prime Minister, putting in his word. You had S.M. Bruce, a former Prime Minister, suggesting subtly or not so subtly to the British that Australia might indeed have trouble repaying loans if the climate were not eased a little. You had the British representative in Canberra, Crutchley, the equivalent of the High Commissioner, running around like mad. You had Sir Alexander Hall Ruthven, the later Lord Gowrie and Governor-General of Australia, who was then the Governor of South Australia, who was away at the beginning of Bodyline, but then when he came back discovering that it was much more serious than he'd thought, he was putting in his slice of the action, and the whole thing became something at an extraordinarily high level involving Canberra Whitehall exchanges that probably were not matched until you got onto apartheid, in a sporting term.
The public furor created by Bodyline was such it made the implacable Douglas Jardine reconsider his strategy, if only momentarily.
After the third test at Adelaide, he did call a meeting of the players and suggest that they abandon Bodyline. Not so much in response to the accusation that it was unsportsmanlike, but because it was having such an effect on the crowd, and they feared that there might be a riot, and the obvious extent to which it was souring relations between the two countries. And they talked about it, but the general feeling, even among those who strongly disapproved of Bodyline, was that it would have looked like an acknowledgement that their tactics were unsportsmanlike, and that's what they couldn't bear to admit.
Bodyline served its purpose. England won the series 4-1 and regained the Ashes. The prime motivation in employing Bodyline tactics, namely to mute the prolific scoring of Don Bradman, achieved the desired results.
He was not quite brought to his knees, but he was transformed into something unrecognisable from the previous 4 years. He came out of it with an average of 56, which is respectable, but it was probably a quarter of what England feared he would average against them against orthodox tactics.
Without the field setting, the whole thing fell down a little bit. I mean, we'd had bouncers bowled before, quite a few, but consistent bouncing of the ball to a leg side field has completely negated all the attractiveness of the game of cricket. All the attractive shots in the game, like the cover drive and things like that, would be non-existent. And I mean, who wants to go out the ground and watch fellas ducking and diving and getting caught off their gloves or getting hit and falling down and so on? I mean, that's no attraction.
The success of Bodyline was ultimately due to the consummate skill of Harold Larwood and his ability to bowl with such sustained accuracy, at such fearsome pace, for such long periods of time.
It was extraordinary, wasn't it, the reception that Harold Larwood got after you think the suffering that he'd caused upon the Australian team and the Australian public, the Australian nation, when you think the reception that he got when he made 98 in the last Test match. He came off as he was a hero. Isn't it strange, wasn't it?
He went in as night watchman. He didn't like that when Jardine said, "Pad up, Harold." He thought he'd done enough already.
He wasn't a bad bat, actually, Larwood. And he said he made 98 runs. And that was Jardine just being tough.
He was absolutely tickled pink. To hear them cheering as loudly as he went off the field as they had screamed at him before when he was bowling really meant a lot to him. I think it took him a while to realise that they were cheering his score, not the fact that he was out.
Deep down, Australians knew that they were watching a great cricketer. They probably realised he was a tool in something, in a system that was larger than himself.
The Australians were delighted to see him do it because they recognised bravery and guts and effectiveness for the team. And Jardine, back in the pavilion, must have been scratching his head and burying his face in his hands, saying, "I don't understand these people."
Douglas Jardine's love-hate relationship with the Australian crowds did have its lighter moments.
There is a story that when the Bodyline was in full flight, and this day Jardine's name went up on the board, and of course the crowd immediately started, and he's making his way to the door and he stops. He took his England cap off and handed it to Hedley Verity, and he said, "Verity, get me my Harlequin cap." He said, "I'll give these so-and-sos something to shout about."
My father enjoyed the sort of repartee, and he told us of an occasion at a Test match in Sydney, where on a very hot day, fielding in the outfield and trying to flit away the flies that were all round him because it was so hot, and some wag in the crowd behind him saying to him, "You leave our bloody flies alone."
The final battle between Larwood and Bradman had a rather poignant conclusion in Sydney.
Larwood bowled his heart out the whole tour on hard Australian wickets, something that he really wasn't used to. And any fast bowler will come down with a great crash on those wickets, particularly somebody bowling at Larwood's pace. And he broke a bone in the middle of an over. But Jardine said, "You finished the over."
And here we had one of the dramatic cameos of the whole series when Bill Woodfull, of all people, was at the other end. And he acknowledged that Larwood was a bruised and battered warrior, and he treated him kindly.
All Larwood could do, apparently, was to stand at the crease and roll his arm over. And he said, I thought to myself, well, here's 5 fours. And Dad just patted the ball gently back to Larwood and refused to take advantage. Larwood said that that's the sort of sportsman that Bill Woodfull was.
Larwood asked to go off. Larwood, you are not going off until Bradman is out. And you're not only not going off, but you're going to field at cover point so that Bradman can see you every time he looks up.
Fortunately for Harold Larwood, Don Bradman was dismissed shortly afterwards, and the pair of them then walked off. Jardine said, "You can go now, Harold." And they walked off, of course, without speaking to each other or acknowledging each other. And there you had the two key characters of the Bodyline series leaving the arena shortly before the close of this extraordinary series.
Bradman scored only 1 century in this series, and when Walter Hammond hit the winning 6 to conclude it, everyone was happy.
England's first captain after the last war, when we went to Australia in 46-47, was Wally Hammond, who'd been, of course, to Australia in 32-33, making his 4th tour to Australia he was. And he was asked on the eve of departure about Bodyline whether there'd be anything of that sort again, and he said, on no account will there be anything like Bodyline. He said Bodyline was bad for the game. He said, I didn't approve of it. And he said, really, he said, when I look back, I'm quite surprised nobody was killed.
MCC didn't hurry to amend the law concerning intimidation. And even when Australia agreed to tour in 1934, they had nothing actually convincing in writing that there would be no... it was only the word of English cricket that there would be no further Bodyline.
Australia's 1934 tour of England was very much about the restoration of friendly relations between the two countries. Bill Woodfull succeeded in regaining the Ashes for Australia and then announced his retirement from cricket at the conclusion of the tour. Australia won the series 2-1 against an England team that did not include either Harold Larwood, Bill Vose or Douglas Jardine.
Jardine knew that the tide had turned against him, really, and resigned before it became an issue. Sent a note to the MCC saying that he had neither the time nor the inclination to play against Australia in 1934, and he reported the series from the press box.
My father did feel abandoned by the MCC, who had agreed that these would be the tactics for the Bodyline tour, and then left him to take the blame.
The MCC were determined not to lose face. And to this day, they've neither apologised nor really come clean on what happened then. And what happened was that they were compelled, slowly and at their own pace, to write into the laws of the game that thou shalt not do that. You cannot bowl bouncers at a man's skull with all those close fielders there.
The MCC lost face in a sense, I suppose, but of course the argument is quite simple here, that they used poor old Jardine and even more poor old Larwood as the scapegoats.
I mean, he was out here bowling his heart out for his country and his captain, and he received these wonderfully congratulatory telegrams from the MCC saying, well bowled, Notts, well bowled, Larwood.
They tried to make Larwood apologise. That was the first thing they did. And Larwood was required by the Nottinghamshire authorities, at the instance of the MCC, to write a letter. And they drafted a letter for Larwood to sign. 1 minute
they're congratulating him, and the next minute they're asking him to apologise for doing what he did. I don't think he ever got over that hurt. I think he hurt inside.
He showed the letter to his mother, and his mother said, Harold, if you sign that letter, "You will never see me again in your life." And he didn't. He never played for England again. He was simply rejected, which is why he ended up in Australia.
In 1950, Harold Larwood, his wife and 5 daughters migrated to Australia and settled in a suburb of Sydney, where he lived very happily for the remainder of his life. Occasionally, he would renew acquaintances with his old foe.
Dad and I had gone to town to do some shopping. I think he was going to buy Enid and I a watch for high school. And we were walking up Martin Place to get the bus home, and Dad said, "Look who's coming here." I said, "What?" He said, "It's Don Bradman." So they stopped and they shook hands and had a chat. We walked away and Dad says, "Well, I bet the people around wouldn't have guessed who was talking there together."
Douglas Jardine visited Australia on business in 1954. He was pleasantly surprised at the warmth of his reception and was delighted to strike up a friendship with Australia's cricket-loving Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies.
And there's a story of them at a dinner, and at the end Sir Bob turning and saying that to my father that he thought he was probably the most unpopular man in Australia. My father very quickly correcting him and saying, on the contrary, that he reckoned that he was more unpopular still.
My father had an invitation from the Melbourne club to attend their centenary in 1977, and he was absolutely amazed, at the attention that he got.
Well, there you see the 2 famous cricketers of yesteryear, Harold Larwood and Bill Voce, accompanied by the chairman of the Australian Cricket Board, Mr. Bob Parrish, who's just applauding the 2 former great fast bowlers as they go out onto the centre wicket. Bill Voce, just taking his coat off, is about to bowl the over, I think.
When he went down to the ground, apparently his name was in huge gilt letters, and they asked him to step onto the ground, and they said that there was a deafening roar went up, and he couldn't believe it. He didn't think anybody would remember him, but he certainly did get a marvellous reception when he went out there in 1977.
It's beyond the powers of any human being.
Perhaps the last word should be left with Australia's captain during the Bodyline series, the gentlemanly Bill Woodfull.
To all our hosts of friends in England, we Australian cricketers send good wishes.
He certainly enjoyed his cricket up till the Bodyline series. And the Bodyline series spoilt his love for the game, and after that he said, "I didn't really enjoy the game anymore." So it took a lot out of him from that point of view. Bert Oldfield, as a matter of fact, said to Mum that he was quite convinced that the Bodyline series had shortened Dad's life.
You felt with Bill Woodfull that there was no one who would have been better suited to see Australia through the difficult few months of Bodyline.
He was a ruthless chap, Douglas. He was most uncompromising. There was nothing that was going to deter him from carrying out right to the end, I would imagine.
Bill Voce moved the ball into the batsman, and that made him quite awkward when he bowled the bouncers.
The keynote for good bodyline bowling is accuracy, and there are very few bowlers who can bowl fast and accurate deliveries. Larwood was one of the very few who could do that.
Don Bradman meant more to Australia then than ever before or subsequently, I would suggest. To see him brought down was such a cruel thing.